I sent my parents $5,000 every month. Then I saw their group chat calling me a family ATM. I stared at the screen, thinking maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe it was a bad joke. Maybe someone else had taken mom's phone and typed it. But the group chat name was unmistakable Family Logistics, and the message was from my younger brother. Lars, ATM just paid. We're good to book the Amalfi Villa. I reread it 3 times. I didn't even know they were planning a trip, let alone to Italy, let alone with my money. The air left my lungs, like someone had hit me square in the chest. But the strangest part was how quiet everything felt. No yelling, no confrontation, just a familiar silence I had learned to survive inside for decades. And that silence was how the story really began. My name is Nikki de Jager. Most people online know me as Nikki Tutorials. And most people think they know my story. Dutch beauty guru, international influencer, proud transgender woman. I've worked with brands across 3 continents, launched products that sold out in hours, and stood on more stages than I can count. But the part of my story no one ever saw, the part I never talked about publicly, was the story behind the camera, the quiet, loyal daughter who kept sending money back home, long after there was any justification for it. And I did it willingly, even proudly, until that one message made it impossible to keep pretending. This isn't a story about makeup, it's a story about money, manipulation, and the moment you realize your own family never saw you as a person, only as a resource. I grew up in Haarlem, a small city just outside Amsterdam. My childhood wasn't terrible, but it also wasn't warm. My biological father left when I was 6, and my mother, Eva, remarried 2 years later. Frank, my stepfather, was charming in public but sharp-edged at home. The kind of man who always sounded calm but left you feeling like you were walking barefoot on broken glass. My half-brother, Lars. I was born when I was 10. Everyone adored him. He had my mother's smile and Frank's cold precision. By the time I was a teenager, it was already clear that if something broke in the house, I'd be the one fixing it. If money was tight, I'd go without first. If someone needed to be blamed, it was usually me. That's not self-pity. It's just how the hierarchy was built. Quietly, repetitively, without ever being said out loud. By 16, I had started posting makeup videos on YouTube in our dim bathroom mirror, using the cheap drugstore palettes I bought with money from weekend shifts at a bakery. At first, my parents thought it was cute, then embarrassing, then something they could maybe leverage. I remember Frank asking once, when I got my first brand PR box, whether I could get anything useful next time, like a new iPhone. I laughed, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. Still, I kept going. I didn't care if they understood. I had finally found something that made me feel like I had control. By 19, I had 500,000 subscribers and enough income to cover my college tuition and help with rent. My mother stopped calling it a hobby and started calling it the family business. That phrase stuck with me in ways I couldn't shake. When I moved to Amsterdam for work, I promised I'd still contribute. At first, it was €500 a month. Then €1. Ling. Then, after I landed a contract with a beauty tech company in Berlin and my income grew, I started wiring $5,000 monthly into my mother's account. It was never asked for directly, just framed as gratitude, framed as the least I could do after all they had sacrificed. Once, I was late by a day, and Mom texted, "Everything okay? We're a bit tight this month. Lars has school stuff." Another time, Frank casually mentioned their mortgage was almost gone. "Thanks to you." They never said thank you. Not really. But I convinced myself that maybe they didn't know how. For nearly 5 years, I never missed a month. I paid off their house. I funded Lars's gap year in Barcelona. I replaced their broken car with a hybrid SUV. I didn't go on vacation. I didn't splurge. And I didn't complain. I told myself it was enough to see them happy. I thought I was being loyal. I thought I was buying peace. I told Maya, my manager and best friend, that it was like a subscription fee to keep my family from falling apart. And then came that group chat. That one message. ATM just paid. That was the night everything snapped. Not loudly, quietly. Like a branch cracking under snow, you didn't realize was heavy. I sat alone in my apartment, watching the message thread grow colder, more transactional with each scroll. There were emoji reactions, jokes, mentions of golf clubs and spa appointments. And suddenly I knew I hadn't been supporting them. I had been financing a life I wasn't even welcome in. After seeing the message, I didn't respond. Not at first. I closed the app and stared at the wall. For what felt like an hour. The radiator clicked quietly behind me. The kind of background noise that only becomes noticeable when your thoughts go dead, silent. I wasn't angry. Not yet. That would come later. What I felt, in that moment, was something closer to shame. Shame that I hadn't seen it sooner. Shame that some part of me had always known. And shame that I had called this loyalty when it had clearly always been control. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about every moment I had sent money with a soft smile. I convinced I was doing the right thing. I remembered the Christmas. I canceled my flight to New York because Frank said Lars had fallen into depression and they needed support. I sent money instead. I remembered the time Mom said her teeth were failing and she couldn't afford dental work. So, I wired over a lump sum, only to later see her tagged in a photo with Lars at a wellness resort. I remembered the brand launch in London. I didn't attend because Mom said it made her anxious when I traveled too far during winter. Looking back, I started to see the pattern. It wasn't always about money. Sometimes it was about control, masked as love. And I had played along willingly. The next morning, I called Maya. She picked up before the second ring, probably sensing something was off by the timestamp of my text at 3:27 a.m. I didn't explain everything. Not yet. I just asked her, "Do you think I've been enabling them?" Her pause told me more than words ever could. "I think you've been generous," she said carefully. "And I think they've been strategic." That was the word. Strategic. My family hadn't just taken advantage of my kindness. They had built a system around it. A schedule. A rhythm. And I had danced to it like a loyal performer. Later that day, I did something I had never done before. I logged into the shared bank access my accountant had set up when I started wiring funds internationally. I hadn't looked at the export summaries in over a year, trusting my mother's voice on the phone more than I trusted spreadsheets. But there it was. In neat rows. A total of $284. 0.000 over 5 years. With most of it categorized under family welfare and household maintenance. The problem was, the house had already been paid off 2 years prior. I remembered the congratulatory call from Frank. "You've given your mother security. She never had," he said, his voice warm. Practiced. Nowhere in the records was there a dental bill, or tuition receipts, or utilities. But there were frequent transfers to a travel account, one that I had never been told about. I didn't cry. Instead, I printed the exports and highlighted the lines in yellow. I needed to see the theft in color. It helped. It made it real. Then I opened the Photos app on my phone and began scrolling. Mom, in a wide-brimmed hat, on a yacht in Santorini. Lars, holding champagne next to a Mercedes that didn't match the car I had bought them. Frank, playing golf with someone I didn't recognize, wearing a Rolex that looked new. They had never invited me on any of those trips. Not once. When I asked about family holidays, Mom would say they didn't want to distract me, that I was too busy, that they didn't want to pressure me to join when I had so much going on. I had believed her. That evening, Maya came over. She didn't ask if she should. She just brought Thai food and sat beside me while I showed her the screenshots. She didn't speak until I was done. This is financial abuse, she said plainly. And emotional neglect. And gaslighting. And at this point, I think it's deliberate. I nodded, but couldn't quite speak yet. She pointed to the printout and said, "Look at this. They didn't just take your money. They built a life without you using it. They took your absence as an asset." That line hit me harder than anything else. My absence was the currency. My distance was the opportunity. We stayed silent for a long while. At some point, I noticed my hands were trembling. Not from fear, but from clarity. Something inside me had shifted. I was no longer trying to defend them. I wasn't making excuses. I wasn't justifying their actions or filtering their intent through a lens of compassion. I was finally looking at what was in front of me without the fog of obligation. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing with certainty. This wasn't about money anymore. It never had been. That weekend, I went home to Harlem. I didn't tell them I was coming. I needed to see their faces before I decided what to do next. The house looked different. Bigger. Brighter. Like it belonged to another family. There were new garden lights, a Tesla in the driveway, and a freshly painted front door that wasn't the dusty green I remembered. When I rang the bell, it was Frank who opened it. He looked surprised for only a moment before switching to the rehearsed warmth he always used in front of company. "Nikia," he said, arms wide like nothing had happened. What a surprise. Inside, the furniture was sleek and modern. There were scented candles on every table. A flat screen mounted across a marble fireplace I'd never seen before. Mom came in from the kitchen, holding a glass of white wine. Wearing silk loungewear that probably cost more than my last coat. She didn't look shocked to see me. Just mildly inconvenienced. "Why didn't you call?" she asked, placing the glass down with exaggerated care. "We weren't expecting you." I told her I had business in Amsterdam and thought I'd stop by. She smiled tightly, and then said something about dinner being nothing fancy tonight. Which made me wonder, what counted as fancy these days? Lars walked in halfway through dinner, dropped his gym bag by the door, and immediately reached for the fridge. He was wearing Balenciaga slides and a hoodie I recognized from a campaign I had done 2 years ago. I had never sent him one. "Yo," he said, barely looking at me. "Nice of you to finally visit." I studied him in silence, watching the way he moved through the house like it was a luxury hotel. No one asked me how I'd been. No one asked about work. They didn't seem curious about anything outside their own orbit. The only question Frank asked was, "So, has the new line dropped?" Yet I answered yes. And he smiled, like someone mentally calculating potential income. I slept in my old room that night, though nothing in it felt familiar anymore. The posters were gone. The desk replaced. The walls repainted. The only thing left was a small mirror on the closet door. I looked at myself in it and didn't recognize the woman staring back. The next morning, I came downstairs to find them having breakfast on the patio. Mom was laughing at something on her phone. Frank sipping coffee and reading headlines aloud. I stood at the door for a long time before stepping outside. "Can I ask you something?" I said calmly. All three looked up. "What's the family logistics chat?" The silence that followed was instant. Lars dropped his fork. Mom blinked twice. Frank adjusted his glasses. "What do you mean?" Mom asked. Too quickly. I didn't answer. I just pulled out my phone and showed them the screenshot. For a moment, no one moved. Then Frank chuckled. "Oh, come on," he said. "It's just a joke." "A joke," I repeated. "Where my name is ATM, and my money funds your vacations, sweetheart." "Don't be dramatic," Mom said, reaching for my hand across the table. I pulled it back. "I'm not being dramatic," I said evenly. "I'm asking for the truth." They tried everything. First came the denial, then minimizing, then guilt. "After everything we've done for you," Mom said, voice trembling. We've sacrificed so much. You gave us this lifestyle, Frank added. You insisted. Lars stayed quiet, but I could feel his discomfort radiating. I gave you support, I replied. I didn't give you permission to lie. I didn't give you consent to use me. We didn't use you, Mom said, almost offended. We needed help. It just grew. No, I said, standing. It didn't grow. You cultivated it. You planned it. You built a routine around it and excluded me from the life it paid for. The drive back to Amsterdam was a blur. I don't remember the radio or the traffic. Just the cold certainty that something had broken and wouldn't be repaired. When I got home, I emailed Elena, my financial advisor, and asked for a full audit. Every account, every shared access point, every card authorized in my name. Then I opened a clean notebook and started listing what I remembered giving them. It wasn't just money. It was time, trust, peace of mind. It was birthdays spent apart. It was holidays missed because someone had to keep working. It was every moment I let my silence be mistaken for agreement. That night, I cried for the first time. Not because they had lied, but because I had allowed myself to believe it was love, and because I didn't know, yet, how to walk away without feeling like I was abandoning them. But I knew I had to try. Elena called me the next morning. Her voice was calm but clipped, like someone trying not to raise an alarm until all the facts were in. I've finished the audit, she said. There are some things we need to talk about. I closed my laptop and sat up straighter, feeling the pulse in my neck begin to rise. Go ahead, I said. She walked me through the findings methodically. There was a secondary savings account under my name, co-managed by my mother. I had no memory of opening it. It had received irregular deposits from my primary business account, all marked as personal reallocation. My mother had access to an old credit card that I thought had expired. Overschieber. 000 had been charged on it in the past 10 months. Flights. Spa packages. A kitchen remodel I'd never seen. But that wasn't the worst of it. There was an investment portfolio labeled LD Future Assets, initiated 2 years earlier, funded almost entirely from recurring transfers from that same co-managed account. LD, as in Lars de Jager. The assets were real estate development projects in Portugal and a tech startup based in Rotterdam, all under his name. I stared at the screen while Elena walked me through the numbers. The entire setup was strategic, deliberate, and worst of all, built using resources I had handed over willingly. They didn't just take your help, Elena said gently. They restructured your trust into their own private equity plan. I thanked her and promised to follow up. Then I sat for a long time without moving. My phone buzzed twice. Once, with an automated payment confirmation to my mother's main account. Once, with a message from Frank. Thanks again, Nikia. Lars's Lisbon trip is fully booked now. He says he'll send pictures. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Something in me had stopped working. Not from anger, but from clarity. They weren't confused. They weren't overwhelmed. They weren't desperate. They were simply efficient. I opened my browser and typed in the name of a therapist Maya had once mentioned during a late-night flight delay. Her name was Dr. Ling Wen, a trauma-informed psychologist who specialized in family boundary recovery and long-term emotional manipulation. I booked the earliest available session. Then I called Maya and told her everything. She didn't say I told you so. She didn't even try to calm me down. She just listened. Then asked one question. Do you want to keep funding people who don't see you? I didn't answer her directly. I wasn't ready to. But the question lingered, repeating itself at night when the apartment went quiet and the reality started to settle into my bones. That week, I began documenting everything. Screenshots, transfers, email confirmations, chat logs, and voice memos. I created folders. I wrote timelines. I built what Maya jokingly called the archive. But it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like self-defense, because the more I looked at the evidence, the more I realized how long I had been conditioned to view control as closeness and guilt as duty. In my first session with Dr. Nguyen, I didn't cry. I spoke slowly, factually, like someone reading from a deposition. When I finished, she sat silently for a moment, then said, "What you're describing isn't confusion. It's calculated erosion. They didn't just cross your boundaries. They built a map of them and drove across daily." I nodded. It was the first time someone had said it out loud in a way that didn't sound like betrayal. But diagnosis. That weekend, I turned off autopay. I sent a single email to my mother, brief and without emotion. Effective immediately. "I'm pausing all financial support. We will discuss future terms when I feel emotionally ready. Please, do not contact me for money-related reasons in the meantime." The response came less than 3 hours later. It was long, dramatic, full of phrases like, "After everything we've done, and how could you treat your own family like strangers?" I didn't reply. I archived it and added it to the folder labeled Tactics. There was no explosion. No confrontation. Just silence. And for the first time in a long time, that silence belonged to me. Over the next 2 weeks, the silence fractured into noise. My mother started calling from different numbers. Frank sent long emails about what this distance was doing to the family. Lars texted once. A vague message that said, "They're freaking out. I think you went too far." I didn't reply. I had told them not to contact me unless it wasn't about money. Every single message circled back to finances. None of them asked how I was. No one asked why I had finally stopped. The narrative was already set in their heads. I was ungrateful, ungracious, too proud to forgive. In their story, they were the ones abandoned. Dr. Nguyen helped me name it. She called it reactive control. When manipulators lose access to your resources, they often switch tactics, not personalities. First, they overwhelm you with guilt. Then they rewrite history to make you the villain. It was classic, she said, and also dangerous if you weren't emotionally prepared. That's when we began scripting responses. I'd never send, but needed to rehearse. "I understand your disappointment, but I'm prioritizing my mental health. No, I'm not willing to discuss finances right now." That was a boundary, not a betrayal. Saying the sentences out loud felt strange at first. Like I was practicing lines in a play where I was suddenly the lead instead of the supporting character. But slowly, the words started to feel like mine. During this period, something unexpected happened. My work got better, sharper. I noticed color palettes I had been ignoring. I pitched creative campaigns with clarity I hadn't felt in months. Brands were noticing too. A company I had been trying to land for years reached out, asking me to lead an entire segment of their European influencer strategy. I accepted, but didn't tell my family. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't want their praise. I didn't want their approval. I just wanted their silence to stay silent. But they didn't stay quiet for long. One afternoon, Maya forwarded me a screenshot from a mutual acquaintance. Someone had leaked a private message thread between my mother and a former beauty client of mine. In it, my mother called me, emotionally unstable. I claimed I was withholding family funds out of revenge, and said I had let the money change me. The thread wasn't public yet, but it had already made the rounds in a small industry WhatsApp group. That night, I opened a blank document and began drafting a public statement, not for immediate use. Just in case. Just to see what it felt like to speak on my own terms. Maya stopped me before I posted anything. "You don't owe the world an explanation for healing from financial abuse," she said. "You owe yourself privacy. Until you're ready." I listened. I closed the laptop. But the weight in my chest didn't go away. That's when I realized something even harder to admit. I had spent so long being useful to people. I didn't know what to do with myself when I wasn't providing something Without the monthly transfers, without the validation, without the illusion of family unity, who was I now? That question haunted me more than the betrayal. Doctor, Nguyen said it plainly. You're grieving. She explained that it wasn't just about losing family connection, it was about losing a role, a sense of identity, the responsible one, the provider, the peacekeeper. Those roles had given me structure in the middle of chaos. Now, without them, I was rebuilding not just my boundaries but my self-worth. Grief without a body is the hardest kind, she said, because people expect you to move on. Like nothing happened. That weekend, I opened a new account, completely private. Under a legal trust structure, Elena helped me set up. I renamed it Freedom Reserve. I didn't fund it with everything, just enough to start reclaiming control. Then I deleted the remaining shared access points. The co-managed account, the expired card, the old backup email. Gone. In place of them, I created a new system with Maya and Elena, a monthly audit, a permissions tracker, a backup statement lock. The rituals felt silly at first, like I was preparing for war. But in reality, I was preparing for peace. The kind that didn't depend on anyone else behaving better. The kind I would build and protect myself. One afternoon, while walking back from therapy, I passed a bakery I hadn't visited in years. It was the one where I used to work as a teenager. The place where I bought my first pallet, with tip money. I went in and ordered a tea. The woman behind the counter was young, no more than 20, with chipped nail polish and tired eyes. She complimented my coat. I smiled, and for a moment, I felt the most unexpected emotion of all, relief. Not because things were easy now. They weren't. But because I wasn't stuck anymore. I had stepped out of the story I was born into and started writing a new one. 3 weeks after I cut off the transfers, my name showed up in a gossip column I had never heard of. The headline was passive-aggressive, in the way only anonymous tip-driven media could be. Beauty mogul, reportedly, abandons family financially. Changed since fame, says source close to inner circle. I knew exactly where the quote came from. The phrasing was too familiar. She used to care about us. Now she only cares about image. She left when we needed her most. It was the same vocabulary I had read in the group chat, but seeing it spun into narrative by someone who didn't even know me hit differently. The article didn't name my mother or Frank, but the details were too specific. The monthly transfers, the unpaid dental bill from 2019, the Christmas trip I had refused to fund. There was enough truth to give it credibility. But the framing was surgical. I wasn't just cold. I was cruel, selfish, greedy. A daughter who forgot where she came from. I didn't cry. I didn't call Maya. I opened my laptop and read the article again. Slowly this time. Not for emotion, but for data. Then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I wrote. Not a script. Not a pitch deck. Not a press release. A letter. To myself. It started with 3 words. You did right. I reminded myself that I had paid for 2 mortgages that weren't mine. That I had answered midnight calls about utility bills, tuition gaps, cas repère, and silent treatments. That I had tried everything short of disappearing to fix a system designed to drain me. I ended the letter with a question. If they can lie in public, why can't I tell the truth? That same day, I texted Elena and said I wanted to record something. Nothing dramatic. Nothing legal. Just my side. She didn't hesitate. We booked a small studio in Utrecht, where I felt safe. I didn't plan a script. I just brought a folder, the archive. On camera. I didn't use names. I didn't drag anyone. I didn't shout. I spoke clearly and carefully, walking through how financial enmeshment works, how guilt can be weaponized, how it's possible to be generous and still exploited. I explained that money had become the only language my family spoke to me in, and when I stopped speaking it, they stopped seeing me as real. I paused twice during the recording. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I wanted to be exact. The internet doesn't forgive sloppiness. When we finished, I didn't post it. Not right away. I sent it to Maya. She watched it and called back with one word: grounded. A week later, the same gossip outlet ran a follow-up. Nikki Tutorials responds to family accusations with graceful, unnamed statement on toxic generosity. The piece quoted me without twisting anything. The comments under the video were different this time. I feel this so deeply. People think you're selfish the second you stop paying for their comfort. This is exactly what happened to my brother. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt steady. Like the ground had stopped shifting under my feet. I hadn't won, but I had finally stepped out of the frame they kept me locked in. That week, a former colleague named Brigitte reached out. She worked for a global mental health nonprofit that partnered with creators on long-term emotional education projects. She asked if I'd consider designing a visual campaign for a new series on financial abuse and boundary repair. I said yes without hesitation. This wasn't about content. It was about clarity. Using the very skills my family used to manipulate me: narrative, aesthetics, emotional tone, and turning them toward healing. Still, the backlash came. In quiet waves. DMs from extended cousins saying I'd embarrassed the family. An aunt sent a 3-paragraph message, ending with "blood is thicker than disappointment." Lars didn't message directly, but I knew he had seen the video because he unfollowed me quietly the next day. My mother said nothing publicly, but someone sent me a screenshot from her Facebook. A vague post about daughters who forget who made their name possible. It got 27 likes. I didn't engage. Instead, I focused on the campaign. I called it Worth Without Owing. Each post featured a different story, visualized in soft color gradients, with text that looked like diary entries. I was the family's emergency fund. They only called when something broke. When I stopped paying, they said I was punishing them. The stories poured in. Real people. Real patterns. Quiet heartbreaks. I wasn't alone. I had just been the most visible one to say it first. I ended the series with one final panel. It said, "Saying no isn't betrayal. Sometimes. It's the first honest thing you've ever done." One night, after recording the final post for the Worth Without Owing campaign, I found myself staring at an old photo. It wasn't staged or filtered, just a grainy Polaroid of me and my mom in our old kitchen. She was smiling at something I had said. Mid-laugh, hand on her coffee mug. I must have been 15. There were scratches on the fridge, a broken clock in the background, and I could almost smell the burnt toast she always made. That version of her, the one in the photo, felt like a stranger now. And maybe that was the hardest part. Not the loss of money, not the betrayal, but the death of a version of love I had clung to for too long. Maya told me once that emotional abuse doesn't always scream, it whispers in patterns. In roles, you're trained to perform until you forget you're acting. For years, I had played the hero, the fixer, the financial parachute, and the longer I did, the more I erased the part of me that needed love without conditions. Looking back, I realized the need to be useful had rooted itself so deep. I mistook it for value. The campaign helped others. Yes, but privately, it cracked something open in me I hadn't looked at in years. Why had I kept paying for a family that resented me? Why did I keep trying to earn what should have been given freely? It was around this time that Frank texted, not with an apology, not even an acknowledgement, just a link. "Grandma's house is on the market. Thought you should know." I stared at the screen for a long time before clicking. It was the home we used to visit every summer, where I learned how to braid hair and make soup from scratch. The listing photos felt invasive, cold, as if all the warmth had been gutted along with the carpet. I asked who was selling it. He replied, "Mom signed it over to Lars. He's flipping it. Nothing to do with me." No explanation. No courtesy. No hint of whether they'd even thought to tell me. I hadn't even known she still had the deed. I didn't cry, but something inside shifted, quietly, like a curtain finally dropping. I realized then I had been mourning people who weren't even willing to send a goodbye. They'd given away pieces of our history without blinking, and still expected me to hold on to the fantasy of family as sanctuary. That illusion had been chipped away over months. But this was the final crack. The next day, I took a walk to the canal near my apartment. It was cold but bright. The kind of day where the wind makes your eyes sting even when you're not crying. I sat down on the bench where I used to record early makeup tutorials with my first ring light duct taped to a bicycle stand. This was where it had all started. Where I had spoken to an invisible audience before they became millions. Where I believed honesty would always be enough. And maybe it still was. Just not in the ways I had once hoped. I opened my notes app and wrote something I hadn't said out loud yet. I am not a bad daughter. I am a boundary. That sentence sat there, staring back at me like a verdict. Not a weapon. Not an excuse. Just a quiet truth I had earned the right to say. That night, I finalized the decision I had been postponing for months. I wasn't just going to set boundaries anymore. I was going to reshape the architecture of my life around them. No more partial forgiveness rooted in fear. No more financial leashes, masked as responsibility. I started the process of legally restructuring my finances, removing all shared authorizations, and placing protections around every future contract or request. I also made a silent vow from this point forward. Anyone who wanted access to my life emotionally, creatively, or financially would have to meet the same standard I had demanded of myself for years. Honesty without performance. I didn't announce it. I didn't post another video. I simply lived it. For the first time in my adult life, silence wasn't guilt. It was peace. I didn't plan for the letter to go viral. It wasn't even supposed to be public. I wrote it for me, as a private closure, a quiet attempt to let go without needing acknowledgement. It was titled, An Open Invoice, and it wasn't about money. It was about years of invisible labor. I wrote it on a flight back from Stockholm, where I'd just spoken at a tech wellness summit about authenticity fatigue. I remember the sky outside being so violently pink, it almost looked fake. That's the thing about nature. It doesn't ask permission to be intense. Maybe that's what I wanted to feel too. In the letter, I listed everything I had given, not just in dollars but in hours, in emotional bandwidth, in patience, no one earned. I wrote, "This is not a bill. This is a record of what I gave without asking, of what was taken without thanks." I talked about the birthdays I missed, the anxiety attacks I paid for in private while wiring thousands to people who didn't call unless they needed something. I didn't name names. I didn't blame. I simply documented. When I finished, I left it on my desktop, unread by anyone but me. A week later, during a podcast interview, the host asked what quiet revenge meant to me. Without thinking, I said, "It's peace that doesn't ask for witnesses." She asked if I ever regretted not exposing them. I smiled, not out of pride, but out of something closer to understanding. I told her the truth. I think they exposed themselves the moment they started treating love like a subscription service. That clip was the one that blew up. People began quoting it under videos, on Twitter, in forums I had never heard of. The comment section on my old makeup tutorials became filled with people saying they finally canceled their emotional subscriptions. Some said they left relationships. Some said they called their parents for the first time in years. Some just said thank you. Then, the letter leaked. I still don't know how. Maybe an old assistant found it. Maybe it was an accident. But one morning, I woke up to my inbox, flooded with requests for interviews, invitations to write a book, even a brand wanting to do a capsule collection inspired by emotional receipts. I declined them all, not out of bitterness, but because for once, I wasn't performing. I had said what needed to be said, not to go viral, not to teach, not to clap back, just to move forward. Frank tried to reach out. I sent a long email, written like a peace treaty, drafted by someone who had just discovered shame. He mentioned seeing the video. He wrote, "I didn't know you were hurting. The line would have broken me years ago." Now it just read, like someone trying to re-enter a room they had burned to the ground. I didn't reply. Not because I hated him, but because silence, this time, wasn't punishment. It was protection. I saw Mom once after that, at a gallery opening in Rotterdam. Of all places. She was standing near a sculpture I'd helped fund, wearing the same perfume she used to keep in the top drawer. The one I used to steal, as a teen. For a second, she looked like the woman in the Polaroid. But when our eyes met, I saw it clearly. The same look of surprise that I still existed without her permission. She walked over, smiled politely, and said, "You look well." I nodded and said, "I am." We stood there in silence. No apologies. No breakdowns. No forced reconciliation. Just two people looking at the same art, living different truths. She didn't ask for a photo. I didn't offer a ride. That was it. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. After that, I flew back home. Not to the house I grew up in. Not to the city that tried to rename me. But to a place I had built with no borrowed pieces. My studio apartment smelled like lavender and old books. My desk had handwritten letters from people I'd never met, thanking me for saying something they hadn't been able to. I read a few, not out of ego, but out of solidarity. That night, I recorded one last video. Not a takedown, not a goodbye, just me, barefaced, sitting in front of the same soft light I had started with. I said, "If you've ever felt like your love was a direct deposit, if you've ever apologized for being tired when all you've done is give, I see you. You are not a bank. You are not a bridge. You are a body. You are a boundary. And you are allowed to protect that." Then I ended the video and closed my laptop. No dramatic fade out. Just stillness. Weeks passed. Then months. The messages didn't stop. But they changed. At first, it was people thanking me for finally saying out loud what they'd been too tired to articulate. Then it became stories, real ones. A nurse from Missouri told me how she stopped covering for her brother's gambling debt after 20 years. A teacher from Nairobi shared that she had left her family group chat after being mocked for thinking too big. A retired mechanic simply wrote, "I was never crazy. Thank you." I didn't answer them all. I couldn't. But I read every single one, quietly, sometimes crying, sometimes just sitting still for hours after. It was like every paragraph added a missing piece to something I didn't know I was still building inside. Not a brand, not a platform, just a different kind of muscle. One that knew how to hold silence without folding into it. One that could look at history and not flinch. My assistant, Julia, asked me if I was ever going to release a statement to the family. She said, gently, that a lot of people online were expecting some kind of confrontation. I told her no. I said, the closure isn't in their reaction. It's in the fact that I don't need one. Meanwhile, the people who once treated me like an ATM slowly went quiet. Not all at once. Some tried guilt. Some tried grace. One cousin even sent me a voice note saying he was inspired by my clarity and asking if I'd help fund his startup. I didn't respond. I didn't even feel angry. I just let the message sit there, unread, like a memory that no longer had a pulse. Then something strange happened. My father sent me a photo. Just a photo. No text. It was of a diner we used to go to when I was little. We hadn't been there since before Mom started treating every family gathering like a performance review. I stared at the image for a long time. At the red booths, the cloudy window, the pie rack behind the counter. For a moment, I wondered what he wanted to say. But I didn't ask. I saved the picture, then archived the thread. One morning, I opened my studio to find a handwritten envelope slipped under the door. It had no return address. Inside was a check for exactly $5,000. No noche. No signature. I stared at it. Not with suspicion, but with a stillness that felt new. Then I shredded it. Not out of defiance, but because it no longer mattered. Repayment means nothing when the original debt was never acknowledged. That night, I walked down to the beach alone. The wind was cold, but clean. I brought nothing but my phone and left it in airplane mode. I sat on the sand and thought about all the things I used to carry. The panic of letting someone down. The fear that saying no meant being unlovable. The belief that survival required silence. I buried all of that in the sand. Not as a metaphor, but as a small ritual. No one saw it. No one needed to. That was the point. Later that week, I gave one final interview. It was for a long-form audio project on emotional labor in families. The host asked me if I ever wished things had turned out differently. I took a breath and answered, "No. I wish I had seen things sooner. But I don't wish they had been different. Because what's real doesn't require pretending." She asked if I would ever go back. To the old home. To the group chat. To the version of me that kept trying. I said, going back is how I stayed stuck. Moving forward is not about revenge. It's about release. That quote ended up as the episode title. I didn't plan that either. Eventually, people stopped asking for drama. The attention shifted. Another scandal took over the headlines. A different family. A different betrayal. But I wasn't chasing attention anymore. I was just living. I started painting again. Not for sale. Just for space. I planted basil on the windowsill. I watched terrible romantic comedies on Fridays with no shame. I found a rhythm. Not of productivity. Of peace. Sometimes, people still recognize me in coffee shops. They don't ask for selfies. They just nod. As if to say, I get it now. I never made a grand return. I didn't show up at any family event to prove a point. There was no dramatic scene where they all begged me back or saw the light. The truth is, sometimes people don't change. Sometimes they don't apologize. Sometimes they don't even realize they hurt you. And you learn to live anyway. Not out of bitterness, but because staying small to earn crumbs of acceptance is a kind of death. Quiet. Slow. Invisible. I chose to live differently. I changed my number eventually. Not as a punishment. Just as a quiet boundary. The old group chat still exists. I assume. Maybe they still use my name as a joke. Maybe they've moved on to someone else. It doesn't matter. I stopped checking. I stopped needing updates. When your peace no longer depends on other people's silence or respect, you become impossible to manipulate. My mom once told me that being a good daughter meant sacrifice. But no one ever said who decided what the sacrifice would be. It took me 33 years to realize that if they only love you when you're useful, they don't love you. They love your function. They love the version of you that feeds the family system and asks nothing back. The real you, the one that says no, that rests, that draws a line, is a threat. And yet, that version of me is the one I chose to keep. One afternoon, while watering the succulents on my windowsill, I got a call from a woman I barely remembered. She was a cousin from my dad's side. We hadn't spoken since we were teenagers. Her voice shook when she said she saw the video. She asked if I was angry at everyone, or just the ones who spoke up in that chat. I told her I wasn't angry anymore. I said I was tired. But in a good way. Like after surviving something you didn't have words for until someone else whispered. That happened to me too. She stayed quiet for a while. Then thanked me. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. I just said, take care of your peace. Even when no one claps for it. The call ended. And the stillness after was the kind I used to chase through vacations and productivity and online praise. But this time, it found me. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge is no revenge at all. Just an honest life. Lived fully. Lived freely. without needing witnesses, without explaining your worth. I still work. I still pay my bills. I still help where I can. But I no longer drain myself to earn the illusion of belonging. My worth isn't up for family debate. My love isn't currency. My boundaries aren't invitations for guilt. They're just boundaries. I learned something unexpected along the way. You can mourn a family dynamic and not hate the people in it. You can walk away and still hope they find their own healing, even if it's without you. And you can live a good blank, kind, beautiful life, even if they never say I'm sorry. That's not a fantasy. That's what healing actually looks like. Not perfect, not loud, just consistent, just yours. Now, when people ask why I cut them off, I say this: I didn't walk away from family. I walked away from a version of myself that thought love required self-erasure. The rest unfolded on its own. And maybe that's the part no one tells you about quiet revenge. It's not about proving anyone wrong. It's about finally becoming someone you no longer have to abandon just to be loved. So, if you're watching this, and you've ever been called selfish for setting limits, or dramatic for speaking up, or cold for choosing peace, let me ask you something. What if you're not broken? What if you're just finally, quietly, becoming whole?